Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky. Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. The last of the old world mob bosses and the ultimate betrayal. For more than 20 years, Joseph Big Joey Massino ran what was called the largest criminal network in the U.S., employing over 250 made men and untold numbers of associates. The Bonanno family was responsible for over 30 murders, even killing a dozen of its own members to enforce discipline and settle scores. Joey Massino would be brought down by Salvatore Good-Looking Sal Vitale, the underboss who was not only Massino's closest and most trusted friend, but also his brother-in-law. In the end, facing the death penalty and the prospect of leaving his family penniless, Massino started talking to the FBI, the first Mafia Godfather, to break the sacred code of omerta, and the end of the centuries-old tradition. The King of the Godfathers, with my special guest, journalist and author, Anthony DeStefano, with the King of the Godfathers, my special guest. Thank you for agreeing to this interview, and welcome to the program, Anthony DeStefano.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much for agreeing to this program. So, first thing, this is an incredible book covering an incredible amount of mafia and mob and La Cosa Nostra history. What is your background as a journalist, which obviously has prepared you to be able to write a book of this magnitude, but also what is your professional journalistic background that would enable you to be able to write this book?
Well, I've been a journalist for over 30-some-odd years, and I started as a cub reporter in New York City for Fairchild News Service, which was really the provider for stuff for Women's Wear Daily and other Fairchild publications, now owned by Condé Nast, by the way. Right. I got into the situation where Women's Wear Daily approached us to write a story about the mob on 7th Avenue in the Garment District in New York City. And I had really no experience or exposure to the mob at that time. This was in the 70s. And we plunged into the project, and this is way before the Internet, way before computers, way before blogs or anything else.
Right.
And you had to go about digging the stories out of the newspaper archives, looking through microfilms and microfiches, burning up shoe leather, going around town, talking to cops, detectives, and people in the Garment District. And we put together this series of stories about La Cosa Nostra and its influence on the garment industry, which is pretty significant in New York crime history,
right,
from the 1930s on. And all the crime families were involved. And, of course, we came across all of the crime families, the most significant being the Gambinos at that time for many years, the Lucchese's with Tommy Lucchese running a dress business, with the trucking companies allegedly in these cartel arrangements. And then we had the Bonannos, who were kind of in there in various ways, either through ownership of dress houses, factories, trucking companies, loan sharking, whatever. And basically we did a series of about 10 stories, and that got me into the sort of institutional history of the mafia in New York City. I mean, we say mafia, they're interchangeable with La Cosa Nostra, although I know purists will say that Cosa Nostra is the American version. Mafia is more of the Italian, Sicilian version, but we're not going to quibble.
Right.
And I got into it, and we did the stories, and it created quite a shockwave at the time. And I stayed with it, and gradually, then my next job was with the Wall Street Journal, and I figured at that point I'm not going to be covering the mob anymore. I'll be doing something a little bit more high in the sights. Well, no sooner than I get to the Wall Street Journal in the 1980s than Geraldine Ferraro became a vice presidential candidate, and questions were raised about her family's background and real estate holdings in Lower Manhattan. And that got us into some characters who were old, mob characters of the time, mostly in the Gambino crime family. There wasn't any connection between her and her family with the crime families, but it was really just sort of real estate interest that really struck our attention. We did some stories at the Wall Street Journal about that. I then got into Newsday, which had a long history of doing mob exposés on mob stories, mostly through the works of Tom Renner and Bob Greene, who were legendary guys in their own right. And I got hired on right about the time that the mob commission case was getting started in New York City. And I was brought in to dig into those stories. And, of course, I'm right back into the mob again. And we had the Gambino crime families, the Genovese, you had everybody back again. You're digging back into the old territory.
Right.
And I sort of stayed with that. And gradually, in the newspaper business, you do all sorts of stuff. I sort of specialized in immigration, legal affairs, because I'm a lawyer by training, although I don't practice. And I was doing all sorts of things for the paper, as you do, as a newspaperman. And gradually, in early 2000, about 2002, I started covering the Brooklyn Federal Court, which was a really very active court with mob cases.
Right.
And that is where the prosecutors out there started indicting the Bonanno crime family. So, because it's my bailiwick, I picked up the case, and I had to write about the indictments. And one of the indictments was, of course, of Joey Massino, who I didn't really know at the time, and but I did get to know, quite a lot about. And Joey Massino's case turned out to be a big case. Although, frankly, I got to tell you, I didn't want to do the case because, frankly, I was a little bored by it. I said, it's just a bunch of wise guys from Queens. They're not that exciting. And it turned out to be, not only pretty significant, but it was the thing that sort of led to this book.
Right.
And that is sort of in a nutshell how I got into it. But there's a lot of miles in there, and a lot of time spent putting together files. And a lot of this is before the internet, so we had to go out and actually dig through files, rummage, and save paper. The file cabinet in my house, is filled with old, sort of musty, weathered and yellowed pieces of paper. Because that's the way you used to do things back then. You used to save paper. You go to the court, you pull paper, you make hundreds of copies under the old Xeroxing type system, and some of that stuff is now faded. But then gradually the internet came about. By the time we're starting to do the Bonanno crime family and stuff in the 90s, you're getting more of a computerization. So it's making the job a little easier. What took us 6 months to do in the 1970s, you could probably do competently in about a month now.
Sure.
2 weeks if you really wanted to do just a hack job.
Right.
But if you really wanted to get into the institutional history, you got to know the history. And that's what a lot of that old spade work does. It gives you that background. And a lot of reporters today, if they're looking for a quick hit, are not going to get that. So that's one of the things that you lose when you don't do it the old way. But make no mistake about it, I'm not a Luddite kind of guy who doesn't like the computers. I think they're very necessary and good for what we do, and very helpful. It made writing this book much more easier than it would have been 20 years ago.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. How long did it take you to write this particular book, by the way?
All
those would-be authors.
Yeah, this particular book, because I covered the trial of Joey Massino, and I had the thread, the chronology in my head, and I knew where all the documents were, and I knew who the important people were, and I had done some interviews earlier. It took me from about the time I really started sitting down to do it, it took about 6 to 7 months.
Wow.
That's the researching and writing. Now, had to do it fresh, and had I not covered the case, the trial, it would have taken probably about a year, because I would have been sort of swimming through the chronology. It's kind of rough because if you don't experience the trial, if you don't get a flavor for the characters, that's something that you need to have by covering a trial, and that's what it gives you. So it's useful for that. Because if you read the dry transcript, you're losing a lot.
Sure.
But I was in court for some of these things, and I could relate to much more deeply what I was reading. I could weave in things that I was seeing at the time that you're not going to get from the transcript. So it's important sometimes to attend these trials. You can read a transcript, but it's not essential. But to attend a trial, but it really gives you a lot more balance and a lot more nuance to the story.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. Now, you have gone through the whole chronological order of the La Cosa Nostra, or the Mafia, or the American Mafia, as we know it here, at least in some of these families here. And you talked about the commission. We're talking about the 60s. You go back to a mobster named Magadino, and where we find Joseph Bonanno and some other people that are also in the commission, Lucchese and also Gambino. So maybe without me going into any names at all, please explain what's going on. Take us back, like you do in the book, to the mid-60s and the rise of Joseph Bonanno, and give us some of the characters in this interesting story where we start in the mid-60s.
Well, yeah, we'll start with Bonanno, because Bonanno was really on the scene by the 1930s. And this was part of that whole period where Lucky Luciano set up the commission as kind of the overriding body and sort of had the five-family structure in mind. And pretty soon thereafter, Bonanno took over the one faction. Not faction, it's really one of the families. And Bonanno persisted for a long time as a boss, through the 40s into the 50s, and then by the 1960s things started to go crazy. He was sort of in his own megalomania, perhaps. He was angering the other mob bosses, and he wasn't building bridges. He was doing things that they did not like, and I think one of them was putting one of his sons, or suggesting that one of his sons actually take over the family. They didn't cotton to that. So ultimately, there was this whole thing where Bonanno disappeared. We were supposedly abducted on the streets of New York in the 60s. He writes in his biography, in Man of Honor, that was the faction, I think a relative from Buffalo, the Buffalo area, for upstate New York, that arranged this, and he was taking some farmhouse in upstate New York. Okay, I tend to think that that's probably not so. That might be a cover story. I think the more likely explanation was that he arranged his own, staged his own abduction and got taken away and went away someplace to get out of the heat, get away and perhaps avoid an assassination. But I think if the mob took him, either his crime family or somebody else, I think there would have been much more. It would have been a much more untimely demise for him.
Sure.
Instead, he came back. I think it was about 2 years later, and reappeared in Manhattan and went to federal court to face some charges. And from there it was history. He was the family was kind of neutralized at that point because the leadership was in disarray. He was not getting the support from the commission. In his absence, other people were running the family. And gradually, when he retired out to out to Arizona, there was a series of acting bosses and committees that sort of ran the family. And this is into the 70s, and things were starting to, it was in flux, and it stayed in flux for a good number of years until Phil Rastelli kind of asserted himself and got power. But that's sort of the short Cliff Notes sort of version of this. In between, there are all sorts of little power struggles that went on, and they pervade the story of The Last Godfather, because the Bonanno family was one where the politics were very unstable for a long period of time, including into Massino's era. And, that in fact set up one of the great sort of murders in the story, the murders of the three captains in 1981 in Brooklyn, which was like a momentous sort of power struggle that ended very badly for the three captains. That's Dominic Trinchera, Philip Giacone, and Alphonse Sonny Red and Delicato. And that was something Massino played a role in setting up. And that was one of the, it's in the book, it's described in a lot of detail. The luring of the three captains to the house, the social club in Brooklyn, rather, and then the sort of signal, the running of the hand through the hair, and then the guys coming out of the closet armed with guns, and the killings which took place in rather brutal fashion in the club. The club was actually a building once the clubhouse of Sammy Gravano. So you see the sort of interrelationships. The Bonannos and the Gambinos, mainly because of Massino, had a lot of sort of interplay. They had a lot of friendly relationships and used each other now and again when they had to. I could go on. I mean, the politics of the family in the 80s, particularly also in the late 1970s, was tumultuous. You had Carmine Galante really asserting himself as the acting boss because Rastelli was in jail. Rastelli went to jail more than he was out of jail, and that created instability because you don't get from the true boss an easy chain of command and easy communication. Rastelli's in jail so often that he had to rely on his street minions, and Massino being one of them, to carry orders and carry out business. And in that period, Galante, who got out of jail, asserted himself. And one of the great things of Massino's time on the witness stand, within the last week or so, was that he described how Galante, became the boss in this period, up until the time he was killed in 1979 in July. Again, in another sort of coup arranged by Rastelli, who wanted to get him out of the way. There was a lot of infighting going on in the Bonannos.
How could Rastelli manage, because there's many mobsters in this book that you even talk about, and a lot of people assume that there's no way of actually being able to retire, but a couple of these guys are forced to retire. Now, how does Rastelli from prison control the family when Galante thinks that he's got this Palermo connection, that he's got the Sicilian stamp of approval here? So tell us how Rastelli can keep power.
Through emissaries, through emissaries, through guys like Massino and other relatives who were carrying messages. Galante wasn't a guy who engendered loyalty, and he was feared, but he didn't engender loyalty. And Rastelli was able to pull this together. I remember the newspaper headlines, and when I was going through my material to do the book, I came across the original UPI yellow teletype paper with a dispatch that Galante was dead, and I've saved it all those years. And he was able to pull it off. He was able to get everybody together, and I think some of the Sicilians went along with it. Massino himself, by the way, testified the other week that he didn't really have a hand in the actual killing of Galante. He wasn't there on the scene.
He was outside.
He wasn't. He said he wasn't even outside.
Oh,
his testimony varies from a lot of the traditional stories in some ways. Some of it's not material, but some of it's interesting. And Joe sees the world in his own way. But I got to take it at face value that look, I said I wasn't there. I wasn't out driving a car, so what are you going to do?
Right.
But Rosselli was able to pull this off and got Galante out of the way. Didn't solve problems within the family, took care of one, but then, you got problems with the three captains. This is in, the early 1980s. And that created another power struggle. Why
did the three captains believe that they could? What were they interested in doing? And how did their murders come about?
It appears that they wanted to gain significant control, and at least a couple of them seem to be into drug dealing. At least that's the claim. And they were arming themselves, and this word got back to Massino and his people, right. And they thought that they were going to be knocked off, so they made a preemptive strike.
Sure.
And they went after them and got them to the club on the guise of a peace conference or a discussion about the dispute to sort of solve things. Sure. Well, they solved things all right. They slaughtered them. And then they used the Gambino crime family, John Gotti's crew, out of Ozone Park, to dispose of the bodies in a lot in Ozone Park in Queens. And another interesting thing Massino testified to was that the bodies were planted in the lot to be found.
Right.
This is his claim. He said two were buried very deep, and one was buried sort of near the top. And he said that was done to show, as a message from the commission, that if anybody tries these kinds of grandstand power plays, that this is what could happen to them. Is it true? I don't know. You have Massino's word for it. So these guys, the one body, Alphonse Sonny Red's body was found by some kids playing in the lot, and they dug it up, and that was Sonny Red. The cops didn't find the other two until about 13, 14 years later.
Okay.
They just didn't dig deep enough. They were there.
Right.
Gotti used a backhoe to plant them.
Right. Why not? Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the most fascinating things, or more fascinating things in your book, for a lot of people that too have watched movies like and are familiar with the Donnie Brasco story, maybe you can explain the convergence here of these two characters, Joseph Pistone, if I'm pronouncing this right, which we know in the movie is Donnie Brasco, or his undercover name is Donnie Brasco. Explain how he incredibly infiltrates the mob, and then how he's connected with the Bonanno family and Galante, and incredibly how he's intertwined in this story. And I'm sure most people don't know anything about this. But explain that Donnie Brasco.
Yeah, Donnie
connection.
Brasco. Joseph Pistone, was one of the first, if not the first, FBI agents to do a long-term undercover penetration of the mob, and he did that in Brooklyn and the city in the 1970s, and into the early 80s. And he did that by, ingratiating himself with the crew of Sonny Black, Napolitano.
Right.
And he got very heavily connected. Now, he didn't have a lot of connection to Massino. Massino, from what we hear, was wary of him. He wasn't sure of his antecedents. He didn't know enough about him. But Sonny Black, through his underlings, got to like Pistone. And Pistone, of course, was the FBI undercover agent. And he was, in deep penetration, gathering evidence, gathering gossip, which then becomes evidence and other leads, which ultimately led to the indictment of people around Napolitano. Now, I say around Napolitano because something very strange happened in the early 1980s. I don't have the exact date, but it had to have been not long after the three captains. The FBI, knowing that they wanted to make Joseph Pistone as a member of the mob, but also picking up vibes that maybe things are getting they're pressing their luck and that somebody may be actually getting on to Pistone, they pulled Pistone out of the undercover operation. And a bunch of FBI agents then went to Sonny Black's club in the Greenpoint, Williamsburg area of Brooklyn. And they went up to him in his club and to the apartment actually above the club, and they said, look, we're FBI agents, and they showed him a picture of Donnie Brasco surrounded by other FBI agents. And they said, well, we want to let you to know, and I'm paraphrasing, the guy you thought, was Donnie Brasco is an FBI agent. We don't want anything happening to him. And I think they made an overture to Sonny Black at that time to say, look, if you want to help us, we're here for you. But he didn't bite. He was an old sort of diehard mobster. And at that point, he knew the jig was up. The guy you trusted for all these years was an FBI agent. And the things you told him, you knew it's not going to be a good ending to this.
Sure.
So there's a classic picture, and I have it in the book, of Pistone going up to the roof above his club where he kept his racing pigeons, and sort of in a meditative state, just surrounded by pigeons, probably the only true friends he can have in the world at that point.
Yeah.
And the FBI was surveilling this whole thing. They surveilled the agents, talking to him. They surveilled Sonny Black on the street with his buddies, with looks of amazement and concern. And then they had this one picture of Sonny Black on the roof with his pigeons. And then, not long after that, Sonny Black disappears.
Sure.
Now, the conventional story, and I say conventional, it's still, unclear, is that Massino and others in the crime family wanted him out of the way because of that. Massino, when he testified, indicated that wasn't true, but that he never said he wanted to give Sonny Black a receipt, which is a code word for death. Mm-hmm. But suffice to say, Sonny Black gets murdered out in Staten Island, and his body gets buried. And a few years later, it turns up when somebody finds it. Some jogger, I think, was in the woods and finds it out in Staten Island. Sonny Black's situation, had he stayed alive, he would have gotten indicted, because they indicted a whole bunch of people for a bunch of crimes out of the Bonanno crime family. One among them were 3 Canton murders. Right. And there was a whole series of convictions. Sonny Black, of course, is dead. He was never arrested. Massino was on the lam. He got word. He said from an FBI source.
What happened to Ruggiero? He was also the guy that vouched for. Yeah, I think he got. As I recall, he got convicted, and I think spent some time in jail. He is now dead. Has been dead for a few years. He died in prison, or was he killed? No, I think he was. He got freed. Ultimately, I think he died out of prison. And a whole bunch of people were convicted in various aspects of the case. But it's like one of these jumbled cases where some people got acquitted, some people got convicted, some people got convicted of certain things and acquitted of others. It was the first Donnie Brasco use of evidence in this case. How did he really convince them? Like, I don't know if I still understand exactly how he could infiltrate this gang on any level whatsoever, despite and never mind the level that he got to. How did he really do that? Well, I think he did it by a long-term penetration, not pushing it. Just getting their confidence by able to supposedly dispose of stolen property. He wasn't really disposing of it in the criminal network. The FBI was taking it and then providing him with money to pay these guys, so they were lulled into a sense of security about him. And that's what happened. He got it vouched by being able to produce for them. Plus, he had a good line of patter. But let's face it had to have been very tough. I think if you read Pistone's own books, it shows you how tough it was. He was separated from his own family, and the stress of these undercover operations is really, incredible. Sure. Particularly when you get to know these guys. There's a lot of psychological
dimension to this that you it's almost like a Stockholm syndrome where you get to identify with these guys in some ways.
Sure.
I'm not saying Pistone did, but I'm sure it had to have been tough.
Sure.
To see some of these guys get arrested and some of these guys get killed.
Yeah. It's a very, very strange world to be stepping into, and then having to get out of that.
Others have done it. Others have done it before them. There's Jack Garcia who did it recently with the Gambinos.
Right.
And you've had some other infiltrators in the last few years who have done that. But it's tough. And there's always the chance that this may not work. Or may not work out to your advantage. It gets a little hairy at times.
Sure. Now, this Massino, he gets the order to kill Vito Borelli, and that was in his early days, Joe. Yeah, Vito Borelli. The Borelli. So what was interesting too is that how you talk about how this character in the book named Demio, his specialty was dismemberments, and he got excited at the prospect of doing it. I mean, I think a lot of people.
DeMeo.
DeMeo. Okay, pardon me.
That's and supposedly he was the guy who was supposedly involved. This was again another Gambino Bonanno operation. Massino testified about that recently, in the current case that's on trial, about how apparently Paul Castellano was very angry with Vito Borelli, who had been dating his daughter.
Right.
The relationship ended, and apparently Vito Borelli made the cardinal sin of comparing Paul Castellano to Frank Perdue of Chicken fame. I mean, there's somewhat of a resemblance, but it's sort of comical. Normally you would, if you're of sane mind, you would have just laughed it off. But
sure,
Castellano took it as an insult apparently, and he may have done other things too, because you don't really know the whole story. I find it a little hard to believe that would have set him off, but hey, that's what we're hearing. In any case, the contract was farmed out to Gotti's people, and Massino, who at that point, I'm not sure exactly on the chronology, he may have been or may have been about to have been made Massino at that point. But in any case, Vito Borelli shot dead in behind some cookie warehouse, and Gotti's people took care of it and disposed of the body. And it was one of those grim events. The body's never surfaced. If the mayor was involved, you can only imagine what would have happened to it. Because other trial testimony showed he was a dismemberment kind of guy.
Yeah. Now, what we haven't talked about is really how Joseph Bonanno is related to Sal Vitale.
You mean Joe Massino?
Massino, pardon me, is related to Sal Vitale, and maybe give us a little bit of the characters, even the appearance of these guys, and explain. Like Sal has what's his handsome Sal, good-looking Sal. Good-looking Sal. So tell us a little bit about their relationship and how they know each other.
As teenagers, I mean, actually, Sal was a little younger than that. Joe was older, and Joe was dating or seeing Sal's sister Josephine, who had raised Sal as sort of like she was the sister who was closest to Sal in the family. Right. So Joe got to know Sal through Josephine. And Sal was a younger guy, looked up to Joe, and they became friends.
Right.
Joe taught him how to swim, and Joe was a sort of a lifeguard in his youth, and was sort of a knock-around kind of guy. Joe was, and Sal and him over the years, became friendly, close, I suppose. Joe ultimately married Josephine, and Sal became Joe's brother-in-law by that relationship. And, this is, ultimately it turns out to be bad for Joe, but, he confided in Sal had Sal involved in crimes, and there was a tension, I must say, because a lot of people weren't happy with the way Sal was in terms of his relationship to others in the crime family. He became underboss. A lot of people thought he wasn't worthy of that title or job. He didn't know how to handle and care for his captains, and he got a lot of resentment. A lot of people resented Sal, but Joe sort of kept him around.
Right.
There were some people who thought Sal was an informant or a cooperator secretly, but
why is that?
At that point, well, it was just things. I think if you in the mob, if you don't like somebody, if you want to neutralize them, you start spreading rumors that he's an informant.
Oh, okay.
So I think this was what was going on, but there was no evidence at that time that he was. He didn't become an informant or cooperator until early 2003. But Joe said that he knew the problems they were having with Sal, and was really sort of neutralizing him, sort of an admission that he was screwing up. He sort of didn't give him any captains after a while, and kept him on a short leash. He sort of emasculated Sal, and that created a resentment with Sal. That over the years really came to a head when they all got arrested. And Sal said, "Hey, what do I have to put up with this guy for and protect him? Look what he did to me. He took away my captains. When I got arrested earlier, he had nobody to take care of my family. Screw him." And that really sort of pushed Sal over the edge. And that was a significant blow to Massino later on.
Right.
They had at one point they were close, but the tension, probably if Joe wasn't married to Josephine and he knew Sal, he might not have made him in a position of power. There was must have been a psychological dimension that we don't quite understand here. But Joe, to his detriment, kept Sal around, and Sal ultimately turned.
Right.
Because he didn't treat Sal right, and maybe Sal didn't deserve it. But that was part of Massino's undoing at that point.
Now, what rackets were Sal involved in, and what rackets were Joe more involved
with?
Well,
they had they were found. Look, they took part in murders together. The testimony showed that. Sal admitted it. There were extortions. There was gambling. Loan sharking. They were all involved to varying degrees, but enough that Sal had a serious problem with the law when he got arrested, and the murders, of course, being the most serious thing.
Now we skipped over a little bit that there was a lot of FBI surveillance on the commission, and for about 4 years, if I'm not getting this wrong, about 4 years there was numerous conversations taped. Now, how do they exactly get Sal Vitale?
Well, Sal wasn't ensnared with the commission, any commission or other related wiretaps or bugs. They had a bug in Tony Salerno's Palmer Boys Social Club in East Harlem. There were various wiretaps on Gotti's crew. Angelo Ruggiero was too talkative, and they bugged his house and they bugged his phones. And there were a lot of tapes that came out in the 1980s. But Sal was arrested with Joe in January 2003, January 9th, 2003, day before Massino's birthday. And Sal had some serious trouble on these cases because before Sal and Joe got arrested, a number of top Bonanno captains had been arrested and flipped. And this was a case that was put together by two very good FBI agents who were accountants, but also FBI agents, and did a forensic accounting thing where they tracked certain monies from Massino to certain people, and they made cases against low-level people and pressured them to cooperate. It was the domino effect.
Right.
The domino started to collapse, And pretty soon some high-ranking captains were cooperating against Massino and against Sal. And they knew a lot of bad stuff. They knew a lot about murders. They knew about extortions and other things. So Sal knew of the evidence and knew who was arrayed against him in terms of cooperators. And he decided, look, why do I have to hold out, for Joe? I don't care about Joe anymore. It's changed. Forget about omerta. Forget about loyalty. What he did to me, sort of emasculated me. I'm turning. And he turned. And he was like the capstone to the case against Joe, because he knew Joe so intimately and worked on murders with him. The Borelli case being one of them, to name one, and others too, some of which Sal did himself. So that's the way it went.
So Massino was just more valuable than Vitale, even though they were both involved in murders, and even though there was already other people
Massino was the high-end target.
Right.
Massino was the boss, and Vitale was an underboss, and who really had no portfolio at that point. He was really kind of out of the power structure. In a way, he was not looked upon favorably. He really didn't have much clout in the family. Massino was the boss. Massino was the guy who had been untouchable. Well, not really untouchable, because he did get convicted in the 80s. Was the guy who had built the Bonanno family back up to a position of power after that debacle with Joseph Pistone and the infiltration. Right. And he gave it some clout again. And he was a factor. He made the family a factor. And Joe became tremendously wealthy from his crime activities and some of his legitimate activities too. But Joe was the high-end target. That was the boss. That was their main man. So yeah, Vitale was the building block, a capstone I called him, to the case against Massino, who they had to get.
Now, how do they proceed with Sal and these other guys turncoating on Massino and some other people? So how does the prosecution and the authorities prepare for this trial and prepare for this kind of testimony against these mobsters? It's not an easy trial, and it's not a surefire thing you're going to get convictions either. So no,
it wasn't. What they had to do was have extensive debriefings of Sal and all the other cooperators, Frank Coppa, Frank Lino, and the others.
Right.
And Richard Cantarella, to name another one, and use them, sort of interweave their testimony so that it supports each other or amplifies. Like certain people knew about certain homicides, others didn't, or certain people knew about some aspects of homicides which would dovetail with other pieces. Vitale knew and was present at the three captains' murders, so he was able to verify certain things. Lino was able to was not only present at the three captains' murders, but he could have died. He was a potential target because he came in with them. He came in with the three captains. He would have been killed, but he ran out the back door because somebody forgot to lock it. So he survived. And when he flipped, he was able to give his version of events on the other side, but he gave his version of events, and it dovetailed with what Vitale was telling people and what other people, testified about and what the forensic evidence showed. So they put together like a quilt, and, they stitched it all together, and after extensive debriefings and a lot of photographic evidence, a lot of photographs going back into the 70s they used, they were able to build a very strong case against Joe. Now, Joe he was very surveillance conscious. He's not on any tapes. Well, he was on some early tapes in the 80s, which were useless in this case.
Right.
But in the 90s and then 2000, the 2000 on, there's no photos of Joe. There's no photos of Joe, no video. There's no tapes of Joe. So you had to build a case with witnesses. That's why these witnesses, these turncoats, were so important.
Right. Now, what's the demeanor of Joe Massino through this thing, and also how's the prosecution fare in the preparation of their witnesses? You say they had to stitch this story together. Obviously, it sounds like they were doing a pretty good job. Tell our audience how the prosecution fared in the proceedings.
I think they fared very well early on throughout. The witnesses, like I said, backed each other's stories up, and they backed up the physical evidence. There really wasn't much for Joe to do to combat this stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think he saw early on that this case was going south for him, and he was going to get convicted. So he came up with an idea very early on in the case that he was going to become his own witness if he got convicted. Sure enough, he gets convicted, and he becomes the government's own cooperator, the first official boss in the New York Cosa Nostra to turn. Momentous event. We became aware of that in 2005. He actually was doing it within minutes of his conviction in 2004. Right. Within minutes, he went in to try to see the judge. So they put together a very strong case. He saw it was strong. Said, "What's my trump card here? My trump card is to cooperate myself. Everybody else is cooperating against me. I might as well do something." Right. And as he testified in Vinnie Bassiano's case the last 2 weeks, in the last week, he said, "Look, I want to save my family something, and make a deal with the government, because he had to forfeit a lot of property.
Sure.
$12 million in real estate and cash and gold bars. But he made a deal and kept some rental properties for his wife, so she at least had some income. That would have been Joe's 401k, but he's not going to need that anymore."
No. So when was the last time that he testified?
Yeah, he testified in Vinnie Bassiano's current racketeering trial going on in Brooklyn Federal Court. It's a death penalty case. Vinnie was Joe's loyal captain, loved him, would do anything for him by his own admission, and he's on trial for a murder that is death penalty eligible. And Joe was the sort of star witness.
Wow.
And we've never seen this before, but I try to tell you, seeing Massino on the stand after all that time and writing the book. He actually tracked my book pretty closely when he went through his criminal history, but there were a few wrinkles along the way, stuff that he conflicted with other witnesses on. Nothing terribly important for Bassiano's case, but just interesting. The stuff about the there was one thing that came to mind. It escapes me for the moment, but there were 2 or 3 things that varied from what the previous evidence had been. Interesting, for anybody who follows this, but nothing terribly important.
I guess you make every attempt to be very accurate with these stories.
Yeah, you try to be, because this is, again, you're relating history.
Yeah.
And the record is so complete now that there's no reason for you not to be. You look at the court records, you talk to people, look at photos, you use your own files and stuff, and you try to sort of build the story. You try to be. You have to be. You really want to be accurate because you want to portray things accurately. And, legally, I think you have an obligation to do that.
What are the most profound conclusion that you got out of this, maybe even the most surprising thing that you got out of this, or, again, maybe just the most profound thing that you got out of in doing this entire project and dealing with these guys?
Looking at it long term, it seems that the old mafia code of silence, of course, is dead.
Sure.
There isn't really that much loyalty among these guys anymore either, and that is the interesting thing about Massino. He had a lot of power, but he was a cold, sort of ruthless guy, and that's the impression I have from him on the stand. By the way, when he testified, he's really immoral, cold. And he did not engender loyalty. Fear, yes, but not loyalty. And in the end, it all collapsed. You got to be as tough as you, mean hombre as you could be. But when the going got rough with people, they're going to say, "Hey, I'm going to save myself. I don't owe you anything." That's the interesting thing I noticed about this. Massino did not engender loyalty. The old bosses probably would have, because I think they took care of their people better.
Right. Interesting. And what was your conclusion after this trial as well, in terms of what you had seen? You said you were still witnessing Massino testifying against other mobsters.
Right, it ratifies my feeling that these guys. It's just as somebody once said, it's just a group of criminals with the goal of making money, and that's not a basis for loyalty. And Massino made a lot of money, and in the end, he didn't prove loyalty to his people. He went for his own self-advantage, and this is the conclusion I come to. That's really the sort of weakness now in the mob structure. I don't think it's really going to recover from that.
The thing is, one of the things, because I primarily do stories about murders, and that ends up being serial killers, and it's obviously a different mindset. But I think through the sort of glamorization to a certain degree, the Hollywoodization of these stories, we certainly have this sort of affection for some of them, and there's obviously some movies with a fair amount of humor in there as well. But there's nothing funny about these guys except maybe their oddness and their psychopathic personalities. But these guys are some of the most cold-blooded killers ever that are described in the book.
They kill for sometimes the most trivial of reasons.
Sure.
And they kill for business. There's a wide range of murders that take place in between those two poles. And it's about money. It's really a very naked kind of capitalist mentality, unfettered, unregulated. It's if you can survive, and survival of the fittest here. That's how they keep score. And how much you get at the end. Now, a lot of these guys don't make a lot of money. Joe made tons of it, and he was a legitimate businessman too. He had his restaurant businesses and catering businesses. He had some legitimate. He had a head. Watching him on the stand, he had tremendous recall of facts, and dates, and he had a head and numbers too. He was very good at using numbers and doing math in a business sense. But a lot of these guys don't make it that way. A lot of these guys aren't really that smart, and they don't really put it together. They're killers, they're sort of knuckleheads, and they survive. Maybe they don't. But Joe was able to survive until, I think, the times changed and everything collapsed around him because of there's no loyalty.
Right.
That's really the key here.
Well, it's a great book, King of the Godfathers. It's an incredible read for people who have been listening to the program so far. I also wanted to talk about, you had mentioned a new project that you're talking about, that you're working on right now that's either set to come out. Maybe you can give us the details of Mob Killer. Yeah,
Mob Killer is coming out in June. It's the story of Charlie Corniglia and Gotti's crew in the Gambino crime family. Corniglia was another case I covered in 2009, again in Brooklyn Federal Court. He was really one of the last people of the old Gotti crew out of Ozone Park, and he got convicted of playing roles in 4 murders, and these are very personal murders. Massino would, either order hits or play a role in them, and Charlie was involved from the evidence in this case, and the evidence showed that he was involved in, knifing people, shooting them. It was more personal, direct. It wasn't like the B-52 pilot from 39,000 feet. Charlie was down there with the skiv, and he was doing it. At least that's what the evidence showed in the case. And he got convicted, and he got sentenced to life. And that's the way it's going to be with Charlie. The redeeming factor about Charlie, if you want to call it that, is that he was very loyal and caring to his mom, who was very elderly. And she died at the age, I think it was 96, and back in September. And he used to take care of her and he did everything for her. And a lot of people liked that about him. But he had this, I guess you can call it a psychopathic kind of streak. And he was really one of the last of the old dinosaurs, because the mob had collapsed around him, and he was out on the street until he got arrested. And he lamented. It's not like the old days anymore. He had nothing to do. And the new guys that were coming up, weren't his friends. And it's its own tragic story in a way, but, you can't forget the fact that he was involved and charged with, a series of murders. So it's an interesting story. It's really a story about the waning days of the Gotti empire, right. And he is kind of like the last vestige of that time period. And Gotti's son is involved in some of the story because the evidence showed that Charlie was part of Junior's crew for a time anyway. And, okay. Junior himself went on to 4 mistrials and got out of the life. Charles got out of the life, but, he tried some of the same arguments Junior had, that he wasn't part of the mob anymore. It didn't work for him. And he was like a low-level guy who, got all the heat. Junior, was able to survive and live life out of prison. 4 mistrials would do that.
Now it's probably a matter of how much you paid for your lawyer as well, right? So it's...
Yeah, Charles, he had court-appointed counsel. Junior had retained counsel, some very good ones. And, look, his argument was, I left the mob life. First of all, he denied any roles in any of these homicides that they alleged during the build-up to the case. And he wasn't charged with any homicides, but, the evidence came out that alleged that he was. But he denied it. And I think the jury, and in fact, I know that the jury, because we interviewed some of the jurors afterwards, they thought this, the government was using these witnesses against them, all who had their own agendas, all who wanted to get something. So, what's to say they're not shading the truth here? Sure. And one juror, as I recall, said that, it seemed like a vendetta by the government, like they were picking on Junior. 4 mistrials. Finally the government had to say, hey, this is it. They had what they thought were very good witnesses.
Sure.
John Alight and some others. It didn't work. You can have the best witness in the world, but the jury reads it differently. And that's the interesting thing about the jury system, and that's like something I never forget as a reporter. You never know with juries. On paper, you can have what you think is a very strong case, but, you never know.
Well, there is a little bit to that argument when it is very rare to have 4 stabs at the same conviction here.
Right. That's 4 shots. 4 bites of the apple.
Yeah, so they're pretty zealous in there in trying to have him convicted, but yeah, it's an amazing.
Yeah, they went after him. They thought this last time was the charm, the 4th time, but it wasn't to be.
Well, I just find a lot, especially in America, that a lot of the political machinery is tied to these things as well. So it's not just a prosecution and its quest for a conviction. It's also how you're going to look politically as well. So,
well, I think anybody with the name Gotti, is a target. Is a target for the government, a good high-profile target. But I think we got to move on. Yeah. There are just other things that we have to worry about.
Sure, certainly.
And that's what's going on. You got terrorism, you've got other kinds of organized crime, you got a major drug situation in Mexico bleeding its way into this country. You've got financial crimes that are astonishing. I've been covering the Madoff case for 2 years, so that's been an education and the story. You probably never see that kind of thing again. Sure. At least I hope not. But we have other things to do. But we're still fascinated by these guys, and I don't know why. I ask readers why, and they say, "Well, you just find them interesting." it's kind of romantic, and that's where the mob is now. It's romantic. It's kind of part of the spectacle. And you've got also the reality shows now. What's that? I forget. There was a Mafia Wife or something like that.
Well, it was the Gottis, Growing Up Gottis.
Growing Up Gotti, yeah, that was its own sort of take. It wasn't necessarily, it wasn't anything about crimes, but it sort of came out of the Gotti mystique.
Legend,
yeah. Now you have this thing about them. Was some program? I think women connected to the mafia.
Oh, jeez.
Relatives are doing their own reality show. I don't know. I haven't seen it. Some of them are Bonanno related type people.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Crazy.
T.G. Graziano's, I think, relatives are involved. I think one of his daughters, at least, is. And there's Sammy Gravano's daughter's involved. So, it's become a part of this, the accepted spectacle.
Sure.
In the media. But the stories, if they're good stories, fascinate people.
Yeah. Yeah, but like you say, it pales in comparison to what's going on in Mexico. And, those stories would even shock Americans, I think,
Yeah, well, I think part of the mafia attraction still that remains is that a lot of these people are kind of just like us.
Sure.
Massino was a guy who used to go to work. He had a wife and, daughters and grandkids and lived in a nice house. And, some of these other people are kind of likable in their own way and somewhat conservative politically. I think that's part of the attraction because they seem to be like people like us, next door neighbors. It's also a forbidden life that a lot of us don't take part in, except vicariously, through stories. And that's what stories are about, making some of the stuff accessible.
Well, hit movies and hit television series like Sopranos and The Godfather and things haven't hurt that either. Sort of putting a nice face on organized crime as well. So.
Well, you see it. Tony Soprano was a killer, but he also had a family life that a lot of people could relate to.
Sure.
The daughter going to college, a son who's sort of a misfit, a wife who, had her own issues, and they had all the criminals around him who were doing all these crazy things, and some of them were quite funny in their lives. Yeah, but these are caricatures.
Yeah.
But not too far from reality.
Yeah, apparently not. Yeah.
No, I think that's true.
Well, it's incredible. Well, I wanted to thank you very much, Tony, for this interview about King of the Godfathers, the deadliest mafia don of them all, and also talking about Mob Killer. We'll be looking forward to that in June, and hopefully we'll have you back on the program talking about that book as well. So,
well, I'm glad. Yeah, I'm glad. It was fun doing this, and I hope the listeners got something from this. And the book is still available, and Mob Killers, of course, you can pre-order if you want to. On the usual sort of Amazon or whatever the websites are, and we'll go from there and we'll see how this goes. But it's been fun.
Well, thank you very much, Tony, for a great interview. For those listening, you've been listening to Anthony DeStefano, King of the Godfathers, and his upcoming book, Mob Killer. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, Tony.
Thank you.
Thank you. You've been listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Good night.
Good night.